Hey guys, welcome back to the show. We discuss your psychology, what goes on with you in between your own ears. Yes, we have these problems in our life. We have these symptoms, and those are important to pay attention to. But ultimately, we have ways that what causes these symptoms, whatever this emotional distress is. Let's say it's insomnia. It's dark outside still, so we'll talk about insomnia. Let's say it's insomnia. Yeah, it's a problem. Let's look at how a mismanagement of emotions causes these symptoms, causes these apparent problems. They're not problems. They're just indications of what's going on, and it may even be helpful if you're dealing with insomnia, for instance, to consider that. How do you know it's even a problem? I mean, in a broad abstract sense, who are you to say whether that's a problem? How do you know? Yeah, it's uncomfortable. It's no fun. And yeah, you can go and listen to all these guys and read all these books from people from super prestigious universities who tell you that it does all these terrible things to your brain. But at a certain perspective, you got to step back and go, how do I even know this is a problem? Who am I to say, yeah, take your magnesium, take whatever supplements you need, do whatever you can to minimize the symptom. But also I think it's good to consider, maybe it's not even a problem. Maybe this is just an indication of something I need to work on. Maybe the symptom is putting me in enough pain. I need to get to a place of pain to really manage my issues. And maybe that's what this insomnia is trying to do. It's just trying to make it painful enough. Yeah, it's somewhat painful, and if it's somewhat painful, I'll manage my issues somewhat. But until I'm really in a state of distress, like any other symptom. Okay, so you haven't had a girlfriend in 5 years. How do you know that's a problem? Maybe that's just what you need to experience at the moment to work through whatever issue you have. The issue's it's nothing to do with girlfriends, right? It's what's disconnecting you from girls in the first place. That's the issue. So maybe it's helpful to consider it from that perspective. If nothing else, maybe just take some pressure off yourself, whether it's insomnia, not having a girlfriend in 5 years. Yeah, I mean, maybe the worst thing, if you haven't had a girlfriend in 5 years, that's a sign you're disconnected from women. Generally, right? There's an infinite array of iterations of that, but that's generally a sign that you're disconnected. The last thing you want is a girlfriend, because then it's going to be most likely the archetypal tuned out guy, BPD girl, and you think the last 5 years of being single were bad? Wait until the next 5 years of being with this girl. Wait until that. Maybe you need to manage those disconnected issues before you get a girlfriend. Yeah, pain's great. Pain is what helps us grow. Speaking of pain, well, it's nothing to do with pain. Okay, so I guess I'll just say I'm recording on my computer camera today. So I got a comment about the audio and how there's some static, and indeed there was in my phone, and so I got a new microphone. That didn't work. So maybe it's something with the adapter, or maybe it's even something with the phone. I have yet to figure that out. So we're going to go record on my computer. How's that sound? Is that good? Great. So, what are we talking about today? Oh yeah, Ayn Rand. It's weird because now I don't have my physical notes out. I'm looking at the notes on my computer. Maybe if I do this next week, well, I'm not going to change it now. Can I? Okay, maybe if I do it this next week, I won't do a presentation like I do, but I'll have you look at my notes. That might be boring. It'll add to the boredom. So we're going to talk about Ayn Rand and what I think about her. I got a question from a listener about her, a very general question. Nothing too specific, so I'm just going to talk about my experience with her, the good, what I think maybe needs to be tweaked a little bit, and some takeaways. So I first read Rand. First of all, anything I say that criticizes Rand or objectivism, this is not a criticism of Ayn Rand. This is, maybe I'll probably criticize some objectivists generally, but it's just a criticism of the ideas. I think that this is maybe part of the problem that we're going to get into. That the problem is generally one of rigidity in objectivism, where the rigidity comes from. I think it comes from a very specific place. Philosophically. Psychologically, it comes from a bunch of places, but philosophically, it comes from a very specific part of objectivism. Or one part that kind of bleeds into another, we'll see. But, Rand is one of these figures. It's like Socrates, right? She is the 20th century version of Socrates. She is poisoning the youth of Athens, of America. And it's one of these people where people only criticize her in ad hominem ways, mostly. It's like, oh, wow, she's crazy. She's such a bitch. She was on a bunch of benzos in the 50s. Which may be all true, but my response to that is, so what? Why does that matter? So objectivists, I think, tend to have this maybe more of a negative reaction to any criticism of Rand, because you can criticize Rand with the ad hominem, and we know it's an ad hominem, but just culture lets you get away with it with Rand and a few other people, of course. It's not just Rand, but especially with Rand, I would say. So I just have to preemptively say that in this video. But I like Rand. I liked Rand a lot. I like objectivism. I think there's lots of good parts to it. I think there's some negative parts that could be the seeds of its own destruction, but I think there's some great parts in there too. I first read The Fountainhead when I was 15. I loved it. I just always laughable to me the way that opening scene in that book parallels, because it works. The main character, Howard Rourke's getting kicked out of school. It's very similar to how I was kicked out of school. And that conversation, it's not exactly the same, but it's not too dissimilar, I guess, but not too dissimilar enough. Let's say it that way. And it helped me a lot. But as I got more into it, I saw there were some rigidity problems with not everybody, but just some of the people, some of the main objectivists. I found it was like a midway kind of thing. Like the people who just kind of get into objectivism, who know a little bit, I really like them. And the people who are really advanced and do a lot, I really like them. But it was all the people in the middle who were the most annoying to me. So we're going to talk about that. But first I want to talk about how objectivism helped me. And it probably helped me in a bunch of ways that I can't even put into words. But I'm thinking of a few main ways here. The first way is that it really helps you categorize ideas. As you're going through school or graduate school, you get a bunch of ideas thrown at you, and they can all seem dissimilar, right? They can all seem to be, oh, this guy says this and this other guy says that, but what objectivism really does, and this really is nothing in objectivism, but they're presentations of other philosophies. What they do really well, which is categorize various schools of thought, right? So you have the two different metaphysics. You have idealism and materialism. Then you have the two different epistemologies. You have rationalism to go with idealism, and then you have empiricism to go with materialism. And it really helps you just wade through all the muck in school and conceptualize it and write about it and think about it and relate to other things. When you have, okay, here's these two general schools going on, and there's errors in both. There's good parts of both, but there's also errors in both, and it really just helps you become a better thinker. And because of that, I don't think I would have developed my theory of psychology without some kind of influence from objectivism. As I've said before, I really got the idea from reading a dissertation from an objectivist philosopher, Harry Binswanger, on the biological basis of teleological concepts. Right? Is essentially saying that if we have something in our biology, it is necessarily goal-directed. But I think in a more general sense, I saw these two problems with psychology, especially when I was in grad school. There was the critical race theory, social justice warrior, whatever, patriarchy, feminism, whiteness. And it's really easy to go, oh, this is materialism, this is empiricism, this is materialism, this is a Marxist iteration of those ideas. And then you had CBT on the other hand, and you go, oh, well, this is clearly idealism, this is clearly rationalism. This is, as Leonard Peikoff would say, M1. And it really helped to just put everything in that context for me, to just wade through the muck. And I think I was able to advance, well beyond my years in the field and come up with a theory of how everything works because of objectivism. Is it really objectivism? Yeah, I think objectivism had something to do with it. It was looking at philosophy. It was studying philosophy as a whole through a particular lens of how an objectivist would typically categorize philosophy. I think that was really helpful for me. And the other great thing about objectivism is it's just anti-authoritarian. And, I talked about the midwit theme. There's a lot of people there in the middle. We'll call them brandwords, right? Who just seem to parrot these talking points without, it doesn't seem like they understand what Ayn Rand or objectivism is saying. So, it's authoritarian in that way. But I'm not going to criticize Rand for that necessarily. I mean, maybe there's something, you hear stories about her inner circle, the collective, they called it, back in the 50s and 60s when she was writing Atlas Shrugged, which I did not like. I do not like Atlas Shrugged. I like The Fountainhead. I like We the Living. I think those are both superb. We the Living more so. They're both great books. Atlas Shrugged is pretty bad. I don't like it. We'll talk about why there's a problem here. Yeah, we'll get into that with the problems with objectivism. What was I saying? Yeah, it's anti-authoritarian. So, there's reality out there. There's your mind in here, and the implication of objectivism is you can figure it out. And really, when you read it, yeah, on a first glance reading, or if you get a little bit, yeah, you can pick out some parts where the implication is you better listen to us or you're wrong. And not only are you wrong, but you're evil. I disagree with that term. But overall, the sense, I mean, that's not the sense that I got, right? The sense that I got was, no, you can figure this out. You don't have to listen to anybody. You can do your own thing and it'll work out because you have your own judgment. It's not, you don't have to have faith. You don't have to have luck. You can do your own thing as long as you are adherent to reality. Your success in life is determined in a large part by how well you think, and what thinking means is how well your mind conforms to reality. So I thought that was really helpful. But there was this, there's some rigidity issues that came up. There's some psychological issues I didn't like, especially after I got into Hugo. Excuse me, I've got a throat issue here. Hoping I hold out, making out with my boyfriend too much. So there's a rigidity issue coming up. And it seems to, if I could concretize the rigidity issue, or an indication of where this problem would be, or an indication of why there's a lot of midwit objectivists who I just wouldn't want anything to do with. It comes down to this question that has come up at various points in certain objectivist circles, let's just say. And that is, so John Galt is the hero of Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged. Her ultimate novel. Galt is the ultimate hero of her ultimate novel. And the question is, why wouldn't John Galt if he was out at dinner, why wouldn't he spill wine? Why wouldn't Rand have him do that, right? And I think the answer is, well, it's not essential to his character, spilling wine, so why put it in? And I get that. But maybe spilling wine isn't essential to his character. But what is essential to his character, I think, would be, psychologically, is how he would respond if he did happen to spill wine. I think that would be a great indication of his character. But knowing Rand, or what I know of Rand and objectivism, it just wouldn't be allowed because it's inessential. It doesn't matter. As opposed to somebody like Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, or Gwynplaine and The Man Who Laughs. I mean, these are characters who mess up on a way bigger level than spilling wine. Way more immoral actions they take. Is that essential to their character? Is that what Hugo says? No. But what he's saying is what they do to overcome that. That is essential to his character. And that's why Hugo was such a psychological breath of fresh air, is because the implication from Rand and her characters is rigidity. There is a certain kind of rigidity that, if you're out on a date with a girl and you're spilling wine and you mess up, that's a problem. As opposed to how well you can deal with just spilling wine if you're out on a date with a girl, You guys understand what I'm saying? Like, how do you deal with being wrong? How do you deal with messing up? How do you deal with having character flaws exposed, put in certain stressful events where your character flaws are exposed? How do you overcome that? There's none of that in Rand's novels, and we're going to talk about why, I think. And I think the problem comes down to, not to jump too much to another topic, but the problem comes down to induction in epistemology. Which makes sense, because I think Rand rightly pointed out that epistemology was the center of philosophy. It's not metaphysics. I mean, metaphysics is the study of reality. That's great. Oh, I think I sneeze. Let me repress that. No, I'm not going to repress that sneeze. I'm going to suppress it. I'll sneeze later. So epistemology, induction. There is so epistemology is the central point of philosophy, because it's not reality. You think it would just be the study of reality, but we gotta connect with reality in order to study it. So it's really epistemology. And objectivism paints this view of induction, which is going from particulars, going from concretes to generalizations, going from facts to truths. That's inductive. You kind of figure out what's similar about the facts of reality, or certain aspects of an event or a phenomenon. And how do you group those pieces together to create a truth, to create a generalization? And objectivism has an answer. It says you look at the cause of each of those particulars. And I think that's true. The problem is, I don't know if that's the only way you can induce or come to abstract truths. Because we have this thing, it's the problem of induction. Yeah, how do you group those particulars together? We know what happens, right? Because there is such a thing called truth. It exists. We know what happens, but how exactly does it happen? Objectivism, they say how it happens. And I don't, I'm not an objectivist. I studied it. It's helped me a lot. So maybe I'm saying something wrong here, but they have a very clear, definitive way of how it happens. Rand talks about in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Then there's this other great book, A Logical Leap, by an objectivist philosopher, David Harriman, I think. And also Leonard Peikoff has several lectures on induction and physics and philosophy, and I think that's all really helpful, if you care about philosophy. So what I'm trying to say is objectivism says, yeah, there's one way to go about induction, but I don't know if that's true. I think there's multiple ways, and I don't think we understand all the ways, and I don't even think we understand the mental processes. Yeah, we can look at abstract steps in induction, which I'm not going to get into. I just, if you want me to do a separate presentation on induction, let me know, but that's philosophy. I just want to keep this to psychology as much as possible. I think there's more ways for induction, and I don't think we understand the processes that are really entailed in induction. So what objectivism says is how you arrive at abstract truths. Well, it's this rigid process. It's actually a quite rigid process. So if you don't do that, then you're wrong. And if you're wrong, then you're evading reality. And if you're evading reality, that's the cardinal sin of objectivism, is evasion, the evasion of the facts of reality. Okay, so, there's such a thing called procedural knowledge and declarative knowledge. I'm going to talk about this a couple weeks ago with riding a bike, or, it's with anything. Like riding a bike, swinging a hammer. Okay, so you can give me a bunch of declarative knowledge on why a hammer works as a tool, how it works as a lever, how the weight of the hammerhead, it helps you hammer, how the muscles work in your arm, the radius and all that, how that works, the brachialis. That doesn't help you swing a hammer any better. So, to swing a hammer better, you gotta swing a hammer. And what are the processes behind doing that? Now, objectivism acknowledges that swinging a hammer is the only way to get better at swinging a hammer. I'm sure they would even say that learning about swinging a hammer may help to some degree. You may learn some mechanical advantage you can get from swinging a hammer a certain way if you really understand the declarative knowledge behind it, but it's the amount that's going to help you swing an actual hammer is going to be relatively minimal compared with the experience of swinging the hammer. So they acknowledge that is true, but they don't give the processes to how that works. And nobody does, by the way. Nobody does. I'm not criticizing objectivism for not having a clear process for how that works, but they seem to put it in the context of they know the one way to induction, but I don't think they do. And so I think this lends to rigidity. I mean, this is like the one issue I see, and if I'm wrong about this, let me know. This is the one issue I see that just kind of, because it's at the center of the philosophy, it just kind of reverberates throughout the whole thing, and causes the phenomenon of the Randroid, the personality, psychological rigidity, which we're going to get into that. I think that's a little bit separate issue. Okay, so Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix of DNA, he took LSD, and he had that realization. How did that happen? He's right, I guess. I don't know much about DNA, but let's just assume he's right. What were the processes behind that? I don't think we know. Now, that doesn't matter so much, I think, and I talk about it a little bit in my book with intuition. Right now, objectivism would say intuition is irrational. No, I don't think it is. Your intuition can be wrong, right? Just because you can take a lot of LSD and have an insight, that insight could be wrong. It could be right. We got to come up with a way to test whether that is correct or incorrect. That's the main thing, and that's what Aristotle talks about. That's what somebody like Karl Popper would talk about, he's in my notes here. We're going to talk about him. So that's the main issue, I think, is there's this thing called induction. Yes, it exists. Yes, we need to talk about it. And it's, way better than these other philosophers who, like Hume, who would say it's impossible. I don't think it's this rigid process. And I don't know exactly what it is. I don't know what the beliefs are. Okay, so another example maybe to help clarify this is with the vaccine. You know, the COVID vaccine, when that came out, there were objectivists who were for it and said, oh, you got to take it, otherwise you're anti-science and all this. And I think they were playing into that a lot. And then there were objectivists saying, no, we're not taking this vaccine. And it caused somewhat of a split in objectivism. Caused a split in America. I mean, it's not just the fault of objectivism. I think it happened to all of us. But I think the reason why it caused the split is because typical objectivists would say there's only one right way, there's only one right process to a generalization, which is, I'm not going to trust the vaccine versus, yeah, you better trust the vaccine. How do our beliefs inform that? You know, maybe somebody who didn't trust the vaccine, an objectivist, just had some implicit belief in there of, I'm less likely to trust the government because of certain experiences that I've had. And that doesn't make me right, that doesn't make me wrong, but it leads me to this general conclusion of, you know, I'm just not going to do it. I don't know if I'm right or I'm wrong, but I'm just kind of weighing the odds and I'm not going to do it, versus another objectivist who maybe hadn't had certain experiences. And so they're more likely to trust the science and trust what Fauci said. And right, so there's different. Induction is complicated. Well, I think it can be simple in certain contexts, but in a lot of contexts, I think it's complicated. And to paint it as this rigid thing that we've figured out in this 200-page book or this 10-part lecture, I think that's a bit of a leap. The other problem with objectivism is it places, and people have talked about this, I think, more often than the other one, than the induction. Sorry, I'm playing with my hair, looking at myself. Is that places a lot of emphasis on volition. Yes, free will exists, and I think, you know, if I could psychoanalyze objectivism here, I think it's a big response to the 20th century. The main view in the 20th century of free will is it doesn't exist, and you could say objectivism perhaps unconsciously tries to compensate, and they end up overcompensating for that by saying that free will exists. Of course it exists, but they seem to treat, and of course they don't say this explicitly, but they seem to treat volition as it were this all-powerful thing, that as soon as you see the facts of reality, your mind changes and that's it. Without much regard to emotions and how that can provide, you know, some resistance. And just because you have resistance doesn't mean you're wrong, or doesn't mean that's bad. That's just natural human. That's what we need to go through. We need to go through resistance to let go of some of that emotional baggage. You know, much like, you know, I started talking about in this video, which is, if you have insomnia, how do you know that's a problem? Another way of saying that is, well, maybe that's just giving you resistance that you need to work on. If you haven't had a girlfriend, right? That's a good indication of your resistance, which is great self-knowledge, and you're going to need that for the next stage of your life. And maybe you're hanging on to this insomnia because you still haven't worked through some of those issues that you're going to need to be able to work through to handle whatever is coming down the road. Helpful way to think of it, right? Not true in every situation, but it's a helpful way to think of it. But objectivism, there's very little of that. There's, there's this famous part in Atlas Shrugged where there's this one woman and there's these three men who she's into, and the way that she moves from one of the men to another man romantically seems to happen in the drop of a hat, solely because this other man is the main hero, that, you know, John Galt, he is the ideal man, and the little bit less ideal man, Hank Reardon, who's still a cool guy, she just seems to move on naturally, and he's like, yeah, I get it, no problem. That's weird, right? I mean, I understand the point that she's making is that love is a response to virtue. Its virtue is values. You're generally going to be more in love with somebody who shares your values. I get that. It's just weird at it. So there's no resistance there. Maybe there's a little, but it's weird, right? So you could infer, I think it's right for people to infer that because Rand presents much of her philosophy in novels, which I don't think is a bad way to do it. I mean, she gets criticized for that. No, I think that's a great way to present her philosophy. But at the same time, I think it's also right to infer that, well, maybe this belief that volition is all powerful is part of the philosophy too. Though Rand does not say that explicitly. Can you infer it? Sure. So this is why we get a lot of moralizing, I think, in Objectivism, because they just don't understand psychology. And it's not a dig on Objectivism. Excuse me. It's not a dig on Objectivism only. A lot of people don't understand psychology, but Objectivism has standards. Objectivism has expectations for your behavior. The way a lot of people hide around not understanding psychology is just not have standards and say, oh, do whatever you want. But if you have standards, if you have expectations and you don't understand psychology at all, get ready. There's going to be a lot of moralizing in your future. There's going to be a lot of, Now, moralizing isn't explicitly part of your philosophy and your worldview. I don't care. It doesn't matter. If there's expectations and very little understanding of psychology, you are going to go around judging people, and it's going to come off very grim. And you're going to be saying things like evil just because somebody doesn't align with your exact view of how induction works, and that's the only way that it works. I guess the other part I want to say about Rand, I don't have anything more negative to say, but just as a different view, and I'm not saying Karl Popper's right about everything, but I think it may be a more helpful view to take to induction is somebody like Karl Popper. Maybe there's a way to combine what Rand says about induction and what Karl Popper says about falsifiability. I'm not smart enough to put all that together, but I'm just offering here as a solution to this issue. What Karl Popper says, and it's very similar to Rand in a lot of ways, but it's not exactly similar. But I think the main difference is one of attitude. It's attitudinally different. See, Objectivism gets criticized for being in favor of absolute truth. Like there's certainty and there's uncertainty, and that's not true. Objectivism doesn't say that. That gets confused a lot, and maybe that's Objectivism's fault for calling itself Objectivism. But that's not true. Objectivism says there's truth in a certain context. Is it true that that the sun is just a bright light in the sky? Well, that's true. Now, it's not true in our context of knowledge, what we know here, but if you go to some indigenous tribe who hasn't had contact with science, yeah, that's true. And Objectivism would say that's true given their context of knowledge. And that's what Karl Popper says in a little bit different way. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, for Objectivism, truth is this thing out there, and you better understand it. You better get it, and if you don't get it, you're wrong. What Karl Popper, his view is, yes, there is truth out there, but on our path to truth, it's not a direct line. It's not this direct process of induction that's outlined in this book, right? It's full of error. And so what Popper offers us is a way to correct error. What Objectivism is a way to bask in truth. And both those are right. You just got to figure out a way, I think, to combine those just to make it more useful overall. Right? It's context, right? Objectivism talks about context a lot. If you can only be certain in a context of facts that you know, or Popper talks about falsifiability. Yes, this theory is right. It's right in the fact that it has yet to be disproven, even partially disproven. Right? And I think that's an important part that Rand misses. Now, you can call that philosophy. Yeah, I think part of that is philosophy by having this rigid view of induction, but part of that's psychology too. As aggravated, I think, by the view of volition. But by the way, I think objectivism's view of volition, that it's this all-powerful thing, implicitly makes them latch on to something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of accepted by the objectivists, by the main objectivists. We'll just say ARI, the Ayn Rand Institute. Even though it's clear, cognitive behavioral therapy is clearly an M1 error, it's a misintegration. But I think their proclivity to rely on, I'm just repeating myself, right? So the takeaway here is, look, I mean, there is truth out there. There's a mind in here. There is truth out there. There's a path to that. And objectivism, helps you. For me, though I'm not an objectivist, I'd call myself somebody who's studied objectivism, and it's helped me. It's given me tools, but I'm not going to call myself an objectivist. I probably never will, because the path of truth, it's not direct. Right? It's full of errors. It's full of potholes. And if you ask an objectivist that, they would say, yes, that's true. But objectivism offers no way to manage those errors. It doesn't offer that. And it can even imply that having an error is wrong. You're wrong for having errors. It could even be implied, given the way that Rand's philosophy was initially presented to the public, that spilling wine at dinner is wrong. And could even say something bad about you. The path to truth requires a correction of error. That's the main thing. Objectivists, they say they believe that, but it doesn't come off that way. I think it's objectivism, everything there is correct, but it's not complete. That's what I say about my view of emotions and how they work, and so because of that, how therapy and how it works is, I think what I have here is correct, but I'm not going to say it's complete. I think that would just be, my head's pretty far up my ass, but my head would be so far up my ass at that point if I said that. It's not complete. I'm sure there's things that I'm missing. That's okay, but that doesn't mean what I have isn't useful. It can still be really useful. It's just going to require some editing. Maybe add some things that are really important that I'm missing. That's okay. And I think the same thing is true of objectivism. That's okay. But the problem is that objectivists go around saying that it's true, and it's everything. It's not. I think they need to understand psychology more. I think they need to understand how to correct error more. I think they need to read a little bit more Hugo. Read this guy read about Jean Valjean and how he completely messes up in the most fundamental way. He commits the objectivist cardinal sin of evasion. And he works through it. He becomes a better man for it. They need to read Faust. Not Faust Part 1, read that, but also Faust Part 2. Faust messes up in the most fundamental way. How does he work through that? How does he get to the place where you think he's going to hell, he actually goes to heaven? I think that needs to be in your philosophy. And I think when it's not, then you get the rigidity problem that we have. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I know that went a little long. Let me know what you think, right? Animus@animusempire.com. If you have any questions for me, I did this because of a question from a listener. I love answering your questions. It just really helps me to know what's going on with you guys, what you're thinking about. I think we have a video coming out next week on a couple things. One of them is on the serious young man phase, so we're going to talk about that. And we do free consultations, of course. Like if you want to know more about the therapy that I do, animusempire.com/schedule. Free consultations. Just reach out. Let me know what's going on. It helps you. It helps me. So thank you guys. I'll leave it there, and I wish you all the pain and joy that comes from your own pursuit of truth.